All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to kick off this next session just in the interest of trying to stay on time. Thank you to everybody for joining this breakout today. My name's Tom Stanton. I'm with the Danny Did Foundation, and I just want to thank Dr. Robin Whitney for helping to plan this breakout with me. So we followed this device space at Danny Did for about the past 14 years, and we know that technology within epilepsy is a really fast-moving and exciting space. It's an area of hope for our families and for patients and caregivers. We see and hear daily how urgently our community seeks effective monitoring and alerting resources that are for use outside of the hospital setting. To help us cover the different aspects of this topic, our breakout is going to feature family and patient perspectives from Jennifer Syme and Lauren Nepper, and an overview of the current state of seizure detection from Dr. Elizabeth Donner, a recap of the device task force recommendations by the International League Against Epilepsy from Dr. Johan Zolano, and insights into how artificial intelligence will impact the future of seizure detection and prediction devices from Dr. Sharon Chung. And at the end, we're going to have time for Q&A. So to start us off, I'm happy to introduce Mary Duffy, our Executive Director at the Danny Did Foundation, to share her reflections about the device space in epilepsy.
Thank you, Tom. Again, my name is Mary Duffy. I'm the Executive Director of Danny Did, and it's so great to be here talking about something that's so important. And I'm happy to share my experiences with devices with the group today. Over the years, I've spoken to thousands of caregivers who have reached out to the Danny Did Foundation to learn about SUDEP and the use of devices to help monitor their loved ones. These conversations have revealed a powerful need, which is why this session matters. After talking with people with epilepsy and their caregivers, one thing is clear. They want tools to help them navigate their life at home, at school, at work, wherever their life might take them. And while they're in the ER or the EMU, technology surrounds them, keeping them safe and providing critical data to help guide their treatment. But outside of those environments, they often feel vulnerable. Since medications may not always fully work and triggers can't always be avoided, devices can be their lifeline. These tools alert caregivers to seizures, enabling them to provide seizure first aid and intervene in ways that can lead to safer outcomes. Between doctor visits, the data collected by these devices plays a crucial role in help shaping their treatment plans. We received 3 times the number of calls than we did 2 years ago. Families value these devices for safety, for independence, for peace of mind. But they also demand better. They want accuracy, they want reliability, they want affordability. They are hopeful about what is ahead, especially with the advancements in AI. This session matters because families have shared with us that these devices have saved lives. It's important to meet this patient demand and create tools for those who need them the most and deserve them. I would now like to introduce you to our first speaker, Jennifer Syme. Jennifer lost her 19-year-old son, Brendan, to SUDEP in November 2017. She has served on the board of the directors of Danny Did Foundation since 2021 and serves as the co-chair for community outreach on the Community Outreach Board with the Epilepsy Foundation of Iowa. We're pleased to have Jen with us today, sharing her very difficult but very important perspective.
Thank you. I am honored to be here. I feel like I've shared Brendan's story numerous times, and each time I do, it just feels better and better. So I do appreciate everybody who's been here and shared their stories. It takes a lot of bravery. And my heart is beating so fast right now, so it doesn't get any easier. As Mary said, my name is Jen Syme. I am a board director, or I'm a member of the board at the Danny Did Foundation. But more importantly, I'm here because of that gentleman. Is my screen up? Do I have my slide? Oh. All right, there's Brendan. I'm here because I'm Brendan's mom. Last week on Thanksgiving Day, we celebrated the anniversary of Brendan's life and the day he died. On November 28th, 2017, he was found unresponsive by his roommate in his dorm room at Iowa State in a case of SUDEP. Brendan's journey with epilepsy started in 2008. It was a phone call from the school nurse telling me that his teacher was concerned with the staring spells that he was having in class, and she thought they might be seizures. He was 10 years old and in the 4th grade. The following week, we had our parent-teacher conferences, and his teacher shared more about what she was seeing. And then she shared something that was very important to us. Her daughter had epilepsy. 3 months later, Brendan had his first tonic-clonic seizure while he was sleeping. This would be the first of many tonic-clonic seizures, along with a mix of others that he would experience over the next 6 months as we navigated appointments, medication trials, all while waiting to see a neurologist. In the fall of 2009, just before starting 5th grade, and after our initial pediatric neurology appointment and another change of meds, Brendan celebrated his 11th birthday on August 30th with the gift of seizure control and the feeling like he was a normal kid again. Over the next 3.5 years, Brendan maintained control of his seizures, and for the last 13 months of that time, without medication. In February of 2013, after a sleepover at a friend's, Brendan came home the next day and woke up from a nap and had his first breakthrough seizure. And that his life after that would never be without touched by seizures. Over the next 5 years, Brendan had just 3 breakthrough seizures that we were aware of. And then came the one that took his life on November 28th, 2017. Just 3 months before Brendan died, we had what would end up being his last pediatric neurology appointment. And just a week prior to that appointment, he had another seizure. As a mom, I was very anxious as he was leaving for college in 2 weeks, living and adjusting on his own to independent living for the first time. At that appointment, we discussed the importance of self-care with the added stresses that college can bring, both physically and emotionally, the importance of continued medication compliance, and his doctors thought that the breakthrough seizure Brendan had the week prior was likely just a fluke, and there was no need to make any medication adjustments. We obtained a letter of accommodation for him to have on file at college if needed, and transferred his medication script to the university pharmacy. We covered all things to ensure his transition to college would be successful. But yet there was no discussion of SUDEP, his risk for SUDEP, or any type of device that could help keep him safe and monitor him while he was more independent. We left that appointment with the focus on seizure control so that Brendan could come off his medication, not seizure control to save his life. It was after Brendan's death that I did learn about SUDEP and started to learn more about the devices that are used to help detect seizures and give alert to someone that can assist. It was then that I met the Danny Did Foundation. In 2019, I signed up to run their Chicago Marathon with the team Danny Did. And through that marathon experience, my outreach with fundraising and connecting with their resources, I learned even more about seizure detection devices and their uses. At this time, I started to process and reflect on Brendan's story and all the what-ifs. We all have those. What if we would have known about SUDEP and his risk factors for SUDEP, or that there were devices that could track seizures so he knew if he was truly having control of them? And what if in the early morning of November 28th, 2017, while sleeping in his dorm room, there would have been a device that would have alerted someone that he needed help? Brendan was never given the chance in the 9 years he lived with epilepsy, multiple provider appointments, and 2 different healthcare centers to be informed of or have those conversations. Knowing my son, who is very curious about how things work and how to fix things, ultimately going to college to be an engineer, he would have been very curious about devices that could allow him to track his seizures and provide him added protection. Each year we give a scholarship in his name to a local high school student pursuing a degree in STEM, and our hope is that one of them someday will be a part of technology or a new development and treatment that will enhance and improve the lives of those living with epilepsy. Over the last 3 years since being a part of the Danny Did Board of Directors, I have heard and read testimonials from multiple families, numerous families, who have connected with them for resources and have been provided grants for seizure detection and alert devices. The thanks and gratitude they express for the impact they have seen and felt is enormous. This past spring, I had the honor of traveling to Washington, D.C. for the very first roundtable for devices in epilepsy. It was filled with, the room was full of device companies from startups to multi-million-dollar bigger companies, FDA representatives, and representatives from the Centers of Medicaid and Medicare. The one thing that I took away from that, although I didn't share a lot of expertise about a device, but I did share my lived experience, and so many thanked me for that. They said they get wrapped up in their work, in their digital worlds, or their creating and their innovation, that they kind of forget sometimes who the real lives are that they're working to impact. So I encourage all of you to keep sharing your stories with anybody that will listen. Even if you think they're smarter than you or they have a bigger degree than you, a lot of these people are working for that, and they need to be reminded of the real human experience behind what they're doing. Just yesterday at our meeting, I kind of added this. I was meeting with a woman who had lost her husband to SUDEP, and 2 years later, her son was diagnosed or had his first seizure. She had connected with Danny Did after the death of her son, and then the death of her husband, and then while in the ER, when she was tending care for her son, her first call was to Mary and Tom about what device do we give him. And he is now trialing the new generation of the watch. So that was very encouraging, and just shows you just how important it is to innovate and stay creative. As far as affordability and access for these life-saving devices, we all know that epilepsy care can be quite expensive, and the access to them quite enormous. Living in Iowa, our biggest obstacle for care is our rural areas and how far apart it is to get to a specialist. Many families are traveling 2 or 3 hours and taking whole days off of work to get someplace, let alone then being given all the resources in one appointment. But what Danny did, a lot of the out-of-pocket costs that do come with these devices that aren't covered by insurance, it's organizations like Danny Did that can help families. I do have to admit, though, and as Mary alluded to, the demand is outpacing the resources. In closing, my hope is that we continue to inspire and innovate with technology to enhance treatment outcomes and save lives for those that are affected by seizures and epilepsy. I don't ever want our epilepsy community to be left behind in this technology world, so please keep encouraging. For those of you who are out there doing the work, please do the work. It's important to us, and we thank you.
If we're able to go to the next slide. Our next speaker, Lauren Nepper, is a nurse and nurse educator who has shared her personal story with epilepsy for many years within many settings. She's also a longtime user of epilepsy technology, and she's going to share her story now through a recorded talk.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I live with epilepsy. At the age of 18, I began my freshman year of college for nursing at a small university. I didn't have the greatest home life. In fact, my family was homeless at the time, and I did not have the best relationship with my parents. I was scared, but excited for the new adventure that college is supposed to bring. But only a few months into my first semester, my life changed forever. I was texting a friend all day about the migraine I had, but eventually stopped responding to her texts. Since she was already on her way back to her room from work, she figured she'd stop to check in with me to make sure all was okay. She found me completely non-responsive. I remember bits and pieces of my first ICU hospitalization, but much of what I know comes from stories from loved ones and from reviewing my records. I'd gone into status epilepticus with no known history of seizures. I woke up intubated, restrained with an NG tube, Foley catheter, central line, the works. My nurse told me that I was lucky to be alive. After a week in the ICU and a few more days on a regular floor, I was able to be discharged and go back to school. During the discharge, they gave me the pre-filled education leaflet about seizures, told me never to miss a dose of medication, and told me to follow up with the neurologist I had seen in the hospital, who would not have an opening for 3 months. I tried to dive right back into life like nothing had happened, but that wouldn't really go as planned. I had nightmares about my initial and subsequent hospitalizations. I began to have 3 to 5 grand mal seizures per week, lasting multiple minutes. Every time my school would force me to go by ambulance back to the hospital. I'd sleep on a cart in the ED hallway, feeling sore and completely out of it while they tested my medication levels and adjusted the doses before sending me back to campus. I racked up thousands of dollars in medical bills and had no idea how to deal with all that was happening. I felt isolated and alone and didn't feel like anyone really cared about being proactive rather than reactive with what was turning my life upside down. When I finally got to see my neurologist, we had a long visit where she increased the dose of medication I was on and introduced an adjunct medication. For the next several months, I continued to be in and out of the hospital with seizures and injuries from them. Right before spring semester finals, I was hospitalized after having multiple grand mal seizures at school around a friend who did not know seizure first aid. I was intubated and eventually found to have aspiration pneumonia. As I battled with continuing seizures and the staph infection in my lungs, my heart began to struggle. My ejection fraction dropped down to 15%. I ended up pulling through and finishing out my semester, but the health problems didn't end, and there was always a paralyzing fear of what would happen if no one was around, or if I was only around someone who did not know how to care for me properly during a seizure. Eventually, in late spring, my neurologist told me she'd never seen a case like mine, and she had no idea what to do with me or how to treat me. It was at this point she referred me to my first epileptologist. I tried a third medication in combination with the first two, then a fourth, before surgery was offered. In 2015, I was able to have a neuromodulating device implanted, which has helped but not eliminated my seizures. I've tried many medications and I'm currently on 3, all different than the original medications I was on. I've suffered a dislocated knee, dislocated shoulder requiring surgery, concussions, bitten tongues, fractured wrists, numerous intubations leading to throat surgery, and more, all from my seizures. Yet never was I educated by my original neurologist or subsequent epileptologist about SUDEP risk, seizure detection devices or services, or reputable sources for educating myself. I didn't know what I didn't know, which makes it incredibly challenging to be your own advocate. My senior year, I had a leadership position on campus, meaning I would have a suite mate across a shared living room and kitchen, but no roommate, someone I'd always relied on for safety at night, as my seizures are mostly nocturnal. In a frenzy of anxiety, I took to Google to see if there was anything out there that could help to keep me safe. Through my research, I discovered there were multiple devices on the market, but quickly realized they were all way too far out of my price range. The only reason I was able to obtain the bed alarm I use currently is because of the Danny Did Foundation and their contact information being promoted on one of the device's websites. I've tried other types of devices and services throughout the last 12 or so years, but every time cost has been the largest contributor to inaccessibility or for ending use. The cost issue is very frustrating for me as my insurance companies have always seemed content to spend thousands of dollars on ambulances, ED visits, inpatient stays, and more, when if they'd spent a fraction of that in prevention, I would have felt safer and could potentially have avoided many of the injuries, traumas, comorbidities, and costs associated with my epilepsy. No person should have to go through a seizure alone, or in the worst case scenario, lose their life. For all of those of you attending PAME who have lost a loved one, you have my deepest condolences. I believe that if these prevention and detection devices and services were more available, it would drastically increase peace of mind and quality of life for patients and save healthcare systems and insurance companies significant financial costs. I'm here today to thank the companies working diligently to provide useful seizure detection and prevention devices and services, and to help insurance companies better understand how providing coverage can benefit both patients and their bottom lines. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my story with you today.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Our thanks to Lauren. She's been a terrific advocate over the years. Okay, our next talk is by Dr. Elizabeth Donner, the director of the Comprehensive Epilepsy Program at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. Her strong ties to epilepsy advocacy roles include her role as co-chair of this PAME meeting, as co-lead of ECHO Ontario, and as a board member and scientific committee chair for Epilepsy Canada. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Tom. I want to recognize there's someone's glasses up here. I don't know. Okay. Because that would happen to me, and then I'd be sorry that I didn't have my glasses. Thank you. Thank you very much to Mary and Tom and Robin Whitney for inviting me today to give really just a very brief, high-level summary of seizure detection devices, and I'm going to focus on wearable devices. It's pretty challenging to come up and talk about something like this after hearing from two people so eloquently describe the challenges that they've faced with regards to epilepsy. And thank you especially to Jen for her comments and for sharing Brendan's story. You encouraged people to share and tell their stories, and there's no question for the people that have been coming to this meeting since 2012 that that's been really one of the driving forces that has motivated work and continues to do so today. And I never talk about Suit Up without telling someone's story, and they're only mine to tell because people have asked me to share them, but I really thank you for that. And Lauren, I realize she's not here, right? No. I realize Lauren is not here in the audience, but so powerful for her to share as well how this has impacted her. So thank you. So like I said, just kind of a quick overview of where we sit with wearables for seizure detection. Does this work? Point it down. Can you use words? Sorry, I can't. Yeah, but is it going to work? Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so what is wearable digital health technology? Really, these are just electronic devices that we wear on the body to track our health metrics, and they are meant to provide feedback in real time. So when it comes to using them for healthcare, they can provide help with diagnosing diseases or treating or monitoring diseases. They also maybe are going to improve access to healthcare. Maybe they help people talk to their healthcare providers about their disease in a more comprehensive way. And maybe they encourage people to be engaged with their own healthcare a little bit more. Do you have another one? Okay, but it's going to be... So I think you can appreciate that the adoption of wearables has been pretty monumental, pretty rapid growth in this area. So as of 2020, about 84 million people in the US use some app with health or health-related content. And also of that year, 200 million smartwatches have been sold worldwide. 45% of Americans apparently wear a smartwatch, and 92% of smartwatch users reported that they use these devices to manage or monitor their health in some way. There's been 1 million smart rings sold as of 2022, and 7 million continuous glucose sensors are projected to be sold in this year. And Bloomberg estimates that the wearable industry will grow to 76 billion by 2028. The more devices in use, the more data is available to help build algorithms and grow the field. It's not just me, because I know someone else had this problem too. Yeah? Okay. Might want to. So there is a difference, and you'll hear more about, I think, artificial intelligence and machine learning later, but there is a difference between artificial intelligence and wearables. Wearable digital health technology monitors physiology and health conditions, whereas artificial intelligence and machine learning really aims to develop algorithms and models that can learn from the data to predict health states. And so artificial intelligence and machine learning can be used in wearable digital health technology to add or improve disease prediction and detection. Tom, I'm going to get like a thumb injury from trying to, I don't know what to do. It's not working. Is there a place to point it, like a direction? Oh, well, okay, so that's valuable information. So point in that direction. Okay, I will do that. Thank you. So why do we need, let's see, why do we need wearables for epilepsy? Well, I mean, my God, I can throw this slide away. This is a piece of art that was drawn by a child who had epilepsy, and you can certainly appreciate that on the green side of the face is a seizure day, a day when a child had a seizure, and on the yellow side of the face is a day where a child didn't have a seizure. And we have heard already countless stories about how epilepsy is unpredictable, and epilepsy is frightening. And 1 in 3 people continue to have epilepsy despite the therapies that we provide. And so let's just stop and think for a moment about a patient like Bethany. So Bethany is 35 years old, and she began having seizures in adolescence, and she lives by herself. And she believes that she is seizure-free. However, recently her partner has noticed some kind of staring off spells and some unresponsive spells, and so she's wondering if perhaps seizures have come back. So she went to see her healthcare provider about this, and they've considered adding a medication. But because Bethany is not aware of these events, and it's only if someone is with her that they can appreciate it, how are they going to know if a medication is working when they add another medication? And we know that seizure reporting is unreliable. So in studies that have looked at the seizure reporting by people living with epilepsy, we know that about 50% or half of seizures that people have when they have epilepsy they don't recognize these in themselves. And that goes up to 85% if you consider nighttime seizures. And when we look at children living with epilepsy, and we compare the number of seizures that parents report compared to perhaps more of a gold standard, like when they have EEG monitoring, we know that about half of the seizures that children have are not recognized by their parents. And inaccurate seizure recognition really has consequences. First of all, it results in diagnostic delays, because if we don't know that people are having seizures, we are slow to diagnose them with epilepsy or the kind of epilepsy they have. It also results in inaccurate diagnoses and can lead to undertreatment and overtreatment. Sometimes people overestimate the number of seizures they have. Furthermore, missing the number of seizures people have has a significant effect, obviously, on quality of life. And obviously, as we're here today learning more about SUDEP and mortality related to epilepsy, we know that poor reliability and reporting of seizures could be endangering the lives of people with epilepsy and also the lives of people without epilepsy. If you consider people who think they're seizure-free but drive a car or enter into some occupation that could put others at risk. And we know that seizures are dangerous. 25% of people with GTCs have had at least one serious injury. So maybe it needs batteries. Do you think maybe they want to work on that in the meantime?
You want to just verbally prompt them to change the slides for you?
Sure.
And I'll check on batteries.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Tom. Next slide. Previous slide. Okay. One slide back. Let me just check. Okay, next slide. Now I'm in sync. Thank you. So we talked about how for Bethany, a seizure detection device could help with the reporting of seizures and let her know if a medication is going to work. Now let's think about Sam for a moment. And Sam is going to sound, unfortunately, similar to some of the people that we heard described today. Sam is 17 years old, and he has a diagnosis of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. For people who aren't healthcare providers, people with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy are usually otherwise healthy, developmentally typical young people. They start having seizures as teenagers usually. They have little jerks, little myoclonic jerks, and then and that's those rare myoclonic seizures that I've written there. And then sometimes they have those full whole body shaking seizures called generalized tonic-clonic seizures. Sam is treated with valproic acid, and as I noted there, he has rare small little seizures, and then about twice a year he has a big whole body convulsion. And next year he's going off to university. And this is not an uncommon discussion that we have, and I heard Jen talk about a discussion similar to this, wanting to give young people with epilepsy independence to live their life and go off to university and explore everything life has to offer, but also being worried about what happens if Sam has a seizure. Next slide. And as we've heard a lot about today already, seizures are dangerous, not only for injury, but those generalized tonic-clonic seizures are by far the strongest risk factor that we have for SUDEP, sudden death in epilepsy. Next slide. We know that unattended nocturnal seizures increases SUDEP risk. And as you can see in this graph, the proportion of seizures that are unwitnessed in the orange bars is much, much, much higher at night, and that's not surprising. Next. People with nocturnal seizures are 4 times more likely to die of SUDEP. Next. Nocturnal seizures are more likely to be unwitnessed. And we know we can modify that by paying closer attention to people who have epilepsy. So this is very powerful data that comes out of Torbjörn Thompson and Svensson's work, where they've looked very carefully at how the home environment modifies risk. And what this shows is that by sharing a household, but not a bedroom, you can, if you live alone and you have more than 4 generalized tonic-clonic seizures in a year, you have an 82 times increased risk of SUDEP. And you can reduce that risk by just living with someone in the same household to 34 times, and you can reduce it dramatically to only 20 times increased risk of SUDEP if you also share a bedroom. So the generalized tonic-clonic seizures are still the most important risk factor, but we can modify that by people living with and sharing a bedroom with someone who can help monitor them through the night. Next slide. We've had a lot of discussion over the years about whether a peri-ictal intervention can actually reduce risk. And what we mean by that is peri-ictal means in the immediate time after a seizure, around a seizure, will it make a difference? And I want to tell people that it doesn't always make a difference. And I have families that I know now quite well who have lost someone to SUDEP even when they shared a room, even when they shared a bed, even when they were with their loved one right after a seizure. So In some settings, we believe it can make a difference, but we know it doesn't always work. Next. This data has already been referred to. This is the study that Philippe Rivelin led, called the Mortimus study, where they reported on deaths that occurred in epilepsy monitoring units, which is when a person with epilepsy is admitted for continuous video EEG monitoring. Next. 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 Maybe I'm like being punked. Yes. Oh, you're in charge now. What do you think? Tom. Well, if you can do it from there, I can certainly do it from here, no? It's not working though, right? Well, at least I know it's not just me.
Point it up towards them, I think.
Point it up? Okay. So in that data, I really apologize for this, by the way. In that study of the deaths that occurred in epilepsy monitoring units, they actually had 11 cases of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy where people were hooked up to EEG and other monitors. And so one of the many things that we learned from this study was that in the cases of people that died, they were not attended to, even though they were admitted to an epilepsy monitoring unit, they were not attended to within a quick timeline. But for the 9 cases where people kind of like almost died, those people all had resuscitation that started within 3 minutes of the cardiac arrest, of the SUDEP death. And so what this suggests to us is that at least for this subset of people who had SUDEP, and these were all adults living with epilepsy who were being evaluated for epilepsy surgery, so it's a pretty specific group of people, but at least for that subset of people, it seems to make a difference if someone goes to you after a seizure. And so how can we use wearable technology to help us in epilepsy?
Maybe verbal prompt.
This is like a nice pregnant pause, you know. What do we need from a wearable device to help us with this problem? Well, first we need to be able to track physiological signals, right? So we need to be able to monitor things like heart rate, maybe blood pressure, temperature, things that are suggestive of a seizure, motion, and I'll get into more into that. And then we need that tracking device to sync to a mobile app or some sort of health platform to allow actual real-time monitoring. And we need it to alert caregivers or a medical team or someone to attend to the patient or the person living with epilepsy. And we know that varied physical and physiological changes can be measured during a seizure. So this image from a paper that I co-authored with Dan Friedman, if he's in this room, and Oren Davinsky, shows some of the different signals that we can monitor from people using wearable technology while they're having a seizure. So theoretically, you could monitor EEG if you put sensors on the head. We could monitor sound. We can monitor heart rate, muscles contractions, so actual contraction of the muscles or movement in space, breathing and the oxygen levels in the blood, and changes in the skin. And we can do that by things like an armband, a wristband, or sensors on other parts of the body. And one of the really important things we know is that combining the sensors makes for a better, more sensitive and specific seizure detection technique. So if I only use your heart rate, you think about all the times your heart rate goes up through the day for a variety of different reasons. But if I combine heart rate with your oxygen saturations, let's say, or how your skin is sweating, or how your body is moving, that makes it an even better device. And as I alluded to, there are a few different types of seizure detecting wearables that we can have. The most commonly used and the kind that has the best level of clearance are wrist-worn devices that can monitor accelerometry, how we move in space, heart rate, and skin changes called electrodermal activity. Some devices like that could also include a GPS tracker. There are armband devices that can go most often on the bicep area that detect muscle contractions and pulse rate. These are best used for people during a rest period, as if you wear something like this through the day, they're quite prone to false detection. There are smartwatch applications, and this is if you actually have a smartwatch, that you can just download an app to be used on your smartwatch that's then paired to a smartphone for caregiver alerts. The thing about this is our smartwatches aren't actually approved or cleared as health devices, and so these aren't specific wearable digital health hardware. They're sometimes promoted as such, and that's important to realize that they haven't actually been designed for that application. And lastly, there are EEG-based devices that are kind of in development. These are obviously not necessarily as well appreciated because people have to wear things on their head, but these type of devices can be used for seizures where there isn't a big change in heart rate, let's say, or isn't a big change in motion, and so you actually need to go directly to the brain waves, and that's for something we would describe as like a subtle seizure or a non-convulsive, non-shaking seizure. So, does it have a pointer? No. So what this graph shows are the physiological changes that can be monitored during a convulsive seizure, a whole body shaking seizure, and a non-convulsive seizure. And what's important about this is to understand why the people that have developed the devices, and I know some are in this audience, and to them I'm very grateful, but the people that have developed these devices have had an easier time developing a device for a convulsive seizure than a non-convulsive seizure. So, for example, just a very simple example, if you look at the third bar down from the top, heart rate, you can see in the orange line that when you have a convulsive seizure, your heart rate rises significantly into the more shaded area, which is the area that will be picked up by a device. Whereas if you have a non-convulsive seizure, the blue line, the heart rate actually only rises just a little bit, not enough for it to be alerted by a device. That would be similar for the movement associated with a convulsive versus a non-convulsive seizure. And you can see you might have some different movements during a non-convulsive seizure. We know people can do picking motions with their hands. They could change something about their posture or little bits of twitching, but those are not going to be sufficient to be picked up by most of these devices. And the effectiveness of seizure detecting wearables has a lot to do with the type of biosignal that is being used. So and I've already kind of alluded to this, but the most sensitive, okay, I didn't even put it in there. The most sensitive devices are those that use accelerometry or motion detection as part of their technology, and that really includes the wrist-worn devices and the armbands. We're lucky at the PAME meeting to hear a lot from people living with epilepsy and their families, and when it comes to something like a seizure detecting wearable, the patient and caregiver perspective is probably the most important, because we can design beautiful things. Well, I can't, but the people who do this can design beautiful devices, very high tech, but if nobody wears it, it's a waste of time. Oh, look at this. This is very exciting. Thank you, Tom. Okay, thank you. And so wearables only work if they are worn and charged and on the body. So charging and pairing devices can be challenging. One study found that after training, only about 50% of people were able to use their device. That's after they were trained. 37% of them needed more training, and 13% of them actually needed constant supervision to make sure they were using it. We also know we tend to charge our devices at night. That's when I charge my phone. That's when you need to wear this device 24 hours a day, with a higher risk period being at night. We also know that people with epilepsy express concerns about privacy with regards to their data and the ease of use and the cost. So the considerations for selecting a wearable device, Mary and Tom, I send all my patients to the website of Danny Did because you guys have great information on there, not just, and you link to other data and webinars that you've done that help people to consider what type of device is best for them. I talked a lot about the fact that devices at this point are best for convulsive seizures. And so really, when families come and talk to me and say, what kind of seizure detection device is best for me or my child, the first thing I say is we need to try and find a device that will detect the seizure type of concern. We also need to think about the time of day when seizures happen, because I mentioned that some of these armbands, that they're going to have a lot of false alarms during the day, so they would be better when the body is typically at rest. Probably the most important thing after a person really using the device and being willing to wear the device is that there will be someone available to respond. And so actually I feel very privileged as a pediatric neurologist, as a child neurologist, that all my patients have loving, supportive, caring families that spend time with them all the time and are always available. There's always an adult available to respond to a child. But there's lots of people living with epilepsy, be they from a close family but not physically in the same place as their family, or lots of people living with epilepsy who maybe are not close with their family and don't have an obvious person to respond should the device trigger. We also know that false alarms are a burden. This is something we worry about sometimes for nocturnal monitoring for children, because we know that if the alarms are going off all the time, that will disrupt sleep. We've heard actually earlier today how poor sleep is a risk factor for definitely for seizures and worsening epilepsy. Other considerations are how long is the battery going to last? Is it comfortable? Is there stigma associated with wearing a device of this kind? Is the person willing to wear it? And then, of course, what is the cost? And are they comfortable with the privacy concerns? Wearables aren't the only type of seizure detection device, and a lot of the families I work with use things beyond wearables. Some families use video cameras, and there are video devices that have motion detection as part of them. The challenge with that, of course, is that it only works if you're in front of the video. So this is something that can be applied in the bedroom, aimed at the bed, that may work while a person is sleeping if they have sufficient motion or movement during a seizure. Likewise, there are under the mattress sensors that can be used that essentially have the same type of limitations. Using an auditory monitor, like an audio monitor, even like an old-fashioned baby monitor, those are obviously dependent on a person making sound while they have a seizure. And vital sign monitors, just using an oxygen saturation monitor or a heart rate monitor. The challenges with those is that they need to wear sensors that easily come off, and they're also tied to where the machine is. So it's very exciting where this field has moved, and I think it's dramatically changing how we take care of people with epilepsy and how people live with epilepsy. But there are still some barriers and some challenges. Mostly these devices are limited to convulsive seizure detection, and we need to consider for families what false positive alarms could look like. I hear from families, and it depends where you live and what type of insurance you have, but I hear concerns around cost and insurance coverage, concerns about usability and stigma for some patients. For new devices, and depending on what jurisdiction the device is being developed in, there can be regulatory hurdles, and I think we need to, lobby for those hurdles to be lower so that new devices can be properly tested and come to market. And we talked about some of these other things. The other thing I'm just going to mention is that for healthcare providers, we're not exactly sure how we should be using this type of data, or even how we're going to get this kind of data. So if people living with epilepsy or their families want to share information, for example, from their wrist-worn smart device or from their video camera, how do we kind of integrate that into our healthcare providing? Lastly, as doctors and nurses and providers, we need to remember that the care we deliver, the human care we deliver, should not be transplanted by an over-reliance on technology. So this is my last slide, just to think briefly about the future of wearable technology in epilepsy. I think you're going to start to see an expansion of the types of seizures that can be detected, trying to detect focal and non-convulsive seizures. We're going to see the use of wearables in clinical trials that are evaluating new epilepsy therapies. I'm excited to see how seizure prediction and AI really transform the field, and we'll begin to see risk calculation. So can we get to a place where a device is going to tell a person before they're going to have a seizure, or tell them what their risk of a seizure is that day compared to the day before or the next day? Eventually, I hope we get to closed loop systems. What that means is that the device doesn't only detect the seizure, but maybe it responds. Maybe it delivers some stimuli that we know can help to reduce the risks associated with that seizure. And then over time, I hope we see more collaboration between tech companies and healthcare providers to facilitate integration into some of the health systems that we're already using. That's the end. Thank you. I really apologize for the technical problems.
Thank you again, Dr. Donner. Okay, next I'd like to introduce Dr. Johan Zalano. He is a professor of neurology at the University of Gothenburg. He is an adult epileptologist with research interests in pharmacotherapy, biomarkers, and improved clinical management. He is a member of the ILA Task Force on Telemedicine and was the first author of a global survey on recommendations for seizure detection devices that was reported to the ILA SUDEP Task Force. Welcome, Dr. Zalano.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me, and also for the persons with epilepsy and family that have shared stories today. As an adult epileptologist caring for persons with epilepsy that is often difficult to treat, SUDEP is a topic I think a lot about, and the stories have been very inspiring and also help when we teach younger colleagues. So thank you for that. I've been asked to talk about international recommendations on seizure detection devices, and also the survey we conducted to see the penetrance of these recommendations and others in the medical community. And I think it's a good topic the organizers picked, because it illustrates how a group of experts address the available evidence, and then maybe gives an idea of how the medical community will receive even stricter recommendations should technology evolve. So I think it's interesting. I have no relevant disclosures. My hospital does clinical trials, but I don't get paid extra for that. So we've already heard about the problem that leads up to this, that seizures are common and can have devastating consequences. And technology is improving in a very encouraging way, but implementation is not always straightforward. I mean, when should devices be used, for which patient? And the ILAE, so the International Epilepsy Organization, of which the American Epilepsy Society is the American chapter, they put together a group with a similar organization for clinical neurophysiology to look at the available evidence for seizure detection devices. And we heard about the dual need already. So automatic seizure detection is needed to decrease morbidity and perhaps mortality. So someone can help you if you get injured by a seizure, or arouse you perhaps, but also for objective seizure quantification, especially for adult patients living alone. I mean, knowing if you've had a seizure can be very difficult, but in all epilepsy populations, really, many seizures go unrecognized. I mean, in Europe, we don't have the NeuroPace device with intracranial EEG, but if you look at continuous EEG recordings, you can see that it's very difficult for patients to recognize all seizures. And it's even worse for nocturnal seizures, as discussed. And there are hundreds of devices, not all approved, but the medical community, this task force found, remains quite conservative. And they wondered, can this be perhaps because there is a lack of guidelines? The group, they decided to focus on tonic-clonic seizures. Much of that was because the clear link between the frequency of tonic-clonic seizures and SUDEP risk. So it seemed an intuitive place to start. But also, as we heard in the Shed story, there is a risk of injury, and a quarter of patients with tonic-clonic seizures sustain injuries every year. So the expert group then asked these questions. So can automated devices accurately detect tonic-clonic seizures of all kinds, regardless of how they start? And they also wanted to see, well, can they detect seizures that are maybe not tonic-clonic, so full body shaking, but rather involves only impaired consciousness? And they were very ambitious. They found almost 2,000 articles and read many of them, but only 28 of the articles met their inclusion criteria. And they found that there was actually high quality evidence for detection of tonic-clonic seizures, of both resulting from generalized epilepsy and focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures. There was moderate evidence for detection of seizures without the tonic-clonic component. That technology is improving, they noted, but perhaps still not perfect. So what to do with this evidence? I mean, that is the problem for everyone writing guidelines. How do you implement this in practice? And then they use this Delphi method. It's I don't think there is much of an oracle component to it. It's really an iterative process where you discuss again and again until you reach sort of a consensus. And there is this balance that we heard about. Seizure detection is, of course, very good, but it's countered by false alarm, burden of usage, and cost. And this is not easy. But they did eventually land in this recommendation. They recommend using clinically validated wearable devices for automated detection of tonic-clonic seizures when there are significant safety concerns. And we can discuss later, perhaps, what this means. I mean, there are always significant safety concerns, in my opinion. But especially in unsupervised patients who do not share a bedroom, but where alarm can result in rapid intervention within 5 minutes. And they admitted that it's a weak recommendation, mostly based on their expert interpretation of the evidence. But still, that is what they recommend. They did not feel that it was possible to recommend much for other seizure types. There is a need for more research and development. Nonetheless, I know from my own experience that patients can find great comfort in seizure detection devices also if they do not have tonic-clonic seizures, but there are no recommendations for that. So then that leads to our survey. So now we know what the experts recommend. And they say that for tonic-clonic seizure detection, they recommend use of validated devices. But the ILA SUDEP task force, so the group working on SUDEP, was interested in what is the state of guidelines for seizure detection devices around the world. So we did this in a double approach. We did a survey targeting both ILA chapters, so countries, asking them their boards, what is the state in your country, but also individual physicians around the world. And I will start with the global survey. So of all the responding chapters, most reported that we have no guidelines, 69%. A third said, well, there are international guidelines, probably the ones I just described, and we use them. Germany had their own guidelines, but no other country. We also asked about availability, touching upon issues that were brought up in the previous talks. So how are these devices procured in different health systems? Well, the most common method is actually that patients get them themselves, so without the health care system. And that's important to, I think, in the following discussions, that as medical professionals, we will be, or people like me will be one route to these devices, but there are others, and what that means for gaps, equal access, etc. And in terms of payment, reimbursement is unfortunately relatively rare. So you can see that a small piece of the pie is with reimbursement. Otherwise, patients pay the full cost, or the country was not able to really say, because the payment might vary. But so costs and the way of getting the devices varied. And then we went to individual physicians. We had 157 responders, and it's important to understand that this is a self-selected panel. So these are probably physicians interested in the topic, interested in devices, and that may have sort of influenced the responses. But only 40% of them were aware of any guidelines. And they considered these factors important. So basically the risk factors and some common sense. So availability of a responder is very important. Someone has to be able to respond. The frequency of tonic-clonic seizures, nocturnal seizures, and if the patient has injured him or herself previously. We tested this, their clinical practice, by using case vignettes, and it's a busy slide, but I've magnified one of the graphs here. So it's one adult case and one pediatric case, one child with seizures of different kinds. If either it can be focal with loss of awareness, or it can be tonic-clonic, and then we asked them, well, at what frequency would you prescribe a seizure detection device? There will be some variation because people imagine different cases. When I read the vignettes, I see some of my patients in front of me. So there will be variation. But you can see as the seizure frequency increases, most physicians actually become quite inclined to prescribe seizure detection devices. So I've encircled in red the bars that signify that I will never prescribe a seizure detection device for this patient group. And you can see that that is quite low. So to summarize, for the children with seizures, most physicians would in some circumstances prescribe a seizure detection device. And in tonic-clonic seizures, only 20% would never do so. And when interpreting that, it's important to recognize that these responses are from all over the world. So there may be availability issues that have been integrated into the responses. In adult patients, which surprised me, the pattern was very similar. We are, in general, adult neurologists, a bit more reluctant or not as used to discussing seizure detection devices because of the lack of responders often. And interestingly, there was no big difference between the five, because we varied the response time. So for the adult, for the children, as we heard, we sort of assumed that there would be an adult close by ready to intervene. But for adults, we said, well, if someone is 5 minutes away or 30 minutes away, but that didn't really influence the doctors. So to summarize, there are recommendations for use of seizure detection devices for tonic-clonic seizures when there are safety concerns. And self-selected responders seem quite willing to prescribe them. Most countries have no seizure detection device guidelines, and awareness of the international guidelines seems quite low. And my interpretation is that it's possible that, we can write really strict guidelines, but there needs to be something else for physicians to really start taking this matter serious. If we envision that technology will improve, so we will have super good devices, it may not be enough what we are doing now, writing guidelines, and I'm not really sure what to do. Another reflection that I think is important is that that if we have well-educated patient groups, resource-strong patients group, they may well acquire devices outside of the health system, which is of course good. I think there's a democratic component to that, but that adds extra burden to the professionals for patient groups who are less health literate, resource strong, etc. So, epilepsy doctors, nurses, and epilepsy care providers, it will be an even bigger burden soon, I think, to inform of the available technology, which is improving every time. And I'm a bit worried about our capability to respond to that challenge. But overall, it's the physicians who answered seem very prepared to prescribe seizure detection devices. And I think that was my last slide. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zolano. Dr. Sharon Chung is a statistician and physician scientist. She completed her PhD in statistics at Rice University, her postdoctoral research in animal neuroscience lab at the University of California in San Francisco, and is currently completing her epilepsy fellowship training at UCFC. Welcome, Dr. Chung.
Thank you, Tom and Mary and Robin, and thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your story. I'm going to talk a little bit. I'll talk about seizure prediction and a little bit about artificial intelligence and really just an overview of where we are at this stage. And in comparison to seizure detection, where we already have these devices implemented, really this is at a more early stage right now. And so I'll talk a little bit about where we are and sort of things that we need to think about. I don't have any pertinent disclosures to this specific topic. So what are artificial intelligence and machine learning? So we have a lot of different examples in which this has come into our daily lives now. We have ChatGPT, we have a lot of self-driving cars. I'm from San Francisco, so we see this on a daily basis. And we also have seizure detection devices. So we have a lot of implementations already of artificial intelligence in our daily lives. But what is it exactly in terms of these terms? So artificial intelligence really is any technique that enables computers to simulate human intelligence. And then machine learning is a subset of that, in which it's a subset of artificial intelligence that uses statistical methods generally to learn patterns and then to predict. So there are some, for example, artificial intelligence methods that are not machine learning, like rule-based methods that do not use ML, but do try to simulate things that may generally require human intelligence. And then within machine learning, there are different subsets. For example, there are supervised learning methods, in which the learning methods are going to learn from the labeled data. There are unsupervised learning methods in which you try to learn patterns from unlabeled data. And then there are other forms of other ML methods like reinforcement learning, which we won't talk about. So supervised machine learning uses labeled data to predict outcomes. So what that means is, for example, if you have a bunch of inputs, like the classic thing is if you have some images of, say, cats and non-cats, you could feed those in as inputs, and you want to predict an output, like if it is a cat or if it's not a cat. And so we can use that in different applications, for example, in predicting weather. Most of weather predictions are actually not necessarily based on ML, but more based on physical laws. But there are some methods that have been developed to predict weather based on, for example, time series. If you look at the weather every day and try to predict the weather the next day. And similarly, we can do the same thing for seizure prediction. So if you have a seizure diary, or if you have a device that's recording some sort of data, you can use that to learn from the labeled data as inputs, have an output that you want to predict, learn the pattern that's going to relate those two, and then try to predict on future data what the outcome would be. So the utility of this, of course, there's seizure prediction is similar to, for example, if you have weather. If you have a prediction for weather, we might be able to say, oh, if today's Friday or tomorrow's going to be Saturday, we might say that we might have rainy weather in the next 2 days, so you might want to bring an umbrella. And in the instance of seizure prediction, the use might be to try to have umbrellas like that, like to take extra anti-seizure medications, to try to modify our behaviors, or to try to alert people in advance so that they can be ready. So what steps do we need to take right now to translate where we are, which is we have a lot of different papers that have been published in terms of retrospective analyses that have demonstrated that seizure prediction may be possible, and what do we need to do in order to translate this into clinical practice? And so a couple questions I just want to think about today is, do we know if it's possible? Secondly, is it useful? And then thirdly, which we won't talk much about, is the ethical implications and sort of thinking about ethical anticipatory guidance before it becomes used clinically. So I just want to start first with human performance. So this is really our best baseline comparator now. So how do we do as people in terms of predicting seizures when they're going to occur without the use of machine learning? So we know that from Cheryl Hout's work that some people can predict their own seizures, even in the absence of using any sort of algorithms. So they did a study in which they sent it out to, I think it was 15 or 19 people, and they asked initially, how likely are you to experience a seizure in the next 24 hours in a daily survey and an evening survey? And they asked them to say, are you almost certain that you're going to have a seizure, very likely, fairly likely, quite unlikely, or very unlikely? And then they looked at if they had seizures in the next 24 hours. And they saw that actually for people who said that they were almost certain to have a seizure, the odds of having a seizure were more than 9 times greater odds. If people said they were very likely, it was still quite high odds of having a seizure. And if they said they were quite unlikely, they were less likely to have a seizure. So people are actually able to predict when they're going to have a seizure to some extent. But what do people do well? So they did a follow-up study in 2019 of 64 people over 3 institutions. And they looked at a similar study design to see what people do well in terms of predicting their own seizures. And they found that 20% of people can predict their own seizures well within about 6 hours, but up to 24 hours. So usually that kind of time frame, but not longer than 24 hours. And with the accuracy substantially dropping within a 6-hour period. However, what they did look at is that they found that people are very good at identifying times with no seizure, but actually the sensitivity and the positive predictive value are low for predicting our own seizures, meaning that people are not very good at being able to identify times that are actually going to have a seizure, which have different uses in terms of being able to predict, but we're not doing too well on that on our own. And so what gap do we need for AI to be able to fill for seizure prediction? So number one, there's only about 20% of people who had reasonably predictable seizures. So not all people have predictable seizures on their own, and there's a need for devices or methods that can be used that artificial intelligence can provide to help with that, fill that gap. For people who can predict seizures, they can usually predict when it will not have a seizure, but it's very hard to predict when you will have a seizure, which is also an issue. Another thing to consider is that warning time here is best up to 6 hours, but not really far in advance. And the other question is whether probabilities would be helpful to know rather than just a yes-no prediction. If you knew like you had a 70% chance versus like a 90% chance, that make a difference in what you decide to do. So one question is, what data streams might people be actually consciously or subconsciously detecting when we're able to predict our own seizures? So one is knowing your own seizure history and knowing your seizure diary and what your patterns of seizures you tend to have. They tend to happen mostly at night and they happen every few weeks. Those types of people might be able to predict a little bit better. Some people have pre-seizure symptoms, which might people be sensing, and those can be picked up with different wearable devices that Dr. Donner was mentioning. There's changes sometimes in spiking or in brain waves that happen before a seizure that can be picked up by EEG, whether it be subcutaneously or within the brain. And then sometimes there might be heart changes as well. We know that there's a heart-brain link in that during seizures, heart rate tends to go up sometimes. But there are also cardiac changes that can precede seizures. And so those things might be able to use as well. And then there's hormonal changes as well that people may be sensing. So we know that short-term seizure prediction is possible with artificial intelligence. So this is from the NeuroVista trial. in 2013, and this was the first prospective seizure prediction trial. So they did continuous intracranial EEG in 15 people, and they used the EEG. So the bottom is shown the device. So the device was implanted in their brain. It transmits the EEG signals to that rectangular part over their chest, the telemetry unit, and then it would give them a warning sign of a red, different warning signs of high warning time, low warning time, or medium, depending on what it picked up. And so as it recorded the real-time EEG, it was trained to identify periods of the EEG preceding seizures and then use that to try to predict seizures going forward. So to provide like a short-term, minutes-long warning of seizures that were about to occur. And they found that in those 15 people, it was able to do better than chance in 50%, about half of the people. In terms of what is useful, if we think that we need, if you're going to have a red warning time, so that's saying that you're at high risk for having a seizure, this was correct 100% of the time, only in 2 of 15 people, but it was able to do it in those 2 of 50 people that every time there was a seizure, it was always during a red warning time. And then in a blue warning time period, which was when they were saying that you're unlikely to have a seizure, for 5 of the 15 people, so about a third of the people, it was correct 98 to 100% of the time that there would be no seizure. One of the interesting things here, though, is that they found from some surveys that they did that the impact on quality of life for those people was not yet completely clear. It didn't have a definite impact on quality of life, and the question of that is not really clear, but they did find that people with lowest percentage of red warning times had greater satisfaction. So whether that's because the people who it predicted well already knew that they were going to have seizures and therefore it didn't afford that much of an improvement, or why that isn't completely clear. But overall, this is a major landmark study, and that it showed that their short-term seizure prediction actually is possible, at least, from the EEG. And there are a lot of other studies ongoing right now, which I won't touch on, but using, for example, the RNS device to try to figure out in intracranial EEG and subcutaneous EEG if using wearables is possible to predict. But that's only a subset of people, and so a lot of things, that's something that is much more accessible, seizure diaries, because everyone can keep a diary. And so one huge question is seizure prediction possible with diaries? And data has shown that yes, it is possible to predict seizures above chance with a diary without any electrodes. So this was a study done by Daniel Goldenholtz in 2020. So he worked with Seizure Tracker, and they looked at if you take a seizure diary and you take retrospectively patients who have daily seizure counts. So they took your seizure count every day for the past 3 months. Your average seizure daily duration, how many tonic-clonic seizure, convulsive seizures you have. Can you train a neural network or a machine learning model to predict whether you will have a seizure in the next 24 hours? So they compared that deep neural network to a 3-month average, meaning that if you just look in the past 3 months and you say, what is my average frequency of seizures in the past 3 months? And then use that. So say you had, if you calculate a probability, can you translate that and see how that performs compared to the deep neural network? And so here's an example of what they showed. The y-axis is the probability that machine learning algorithm was calculating for the probably having a seizure, and the x-axis is the day. And so the black line is showing the probability, and you can see the times where there's generally high probability of a seizure, people's seizures tended to occur during those high probability times. And this is one of the better examples that they had. And here they're showing, this is a graph called the receiver operating curve, which just shows on the x-axis a false positive rate. So meaning that if they said that you're going to have a seizure and you did not actually have a seizure, and then the y-axis is showing the true positive rate, meaning that they said you're going to have a seizure and you did have a seizure. The blue line is showing their deep neural network and how it did, and the red line is showing the average. And you can see that both of them do better than chance, which is the black diagonal line, but that the average is kind of similar to the deep neural network. It has been actually replicated multiple times during independent data sets now that it is possible to predict above chance based on diary history. So this is another study done by Pip Carolli's group, in which they looked at heart rate cycles, and they also looked at other seizure diaries, and they modeled a different way of modeling this, which was based on seizure risk cycles. And they saw that at times of high seizure risk, people were more likely to have seizures. So it is definitely replicated that you're able to possible to predict above chance based on diaries. This is one of the most recent studies that has been come out from Daniel Goldenholz, in which he then subsequently did a prospective study. So rather than looking at people whose data has been already collected, they looked at people where they collected going forward. And they looked at, if you look at the 3-month average, how does that do compared to the same deep neural network? And they saw that right now what we're able to do is we're able to do better than random, but not able to do better than calculating just a simple average. So the plot is showing a curve, which is, if you look at the dotted line, that would be the ideal. So that's if you have a mean predicted value, like your predictive 0.5, and the true one is 0.5. So that dotted line would be ideal. And the orange one, which is the average rate, is actually a little bit closer than the blue line is, but both of them are similar and not significantly different. So we know that it is possible. And one other question is how does this relate to the gap that we have? So we know that there's 20% of people who can predict their seizures to some extent, and then we have the other 80% who sort of need more of who may need some help with this. And so is better than a coin flip going to be helpful to some people? So right now we're able to do better than a coin flip, but is that actually useful? And so Daniel Goldenholz's group looked with Empatica and with Seizure Tracker and with simulated data to see, in general, if we compare just looking at chance versus if you just do a matched average, are those reasonable comparators? And we're seeing that it might be obvious, but if you calculate an average, that is generally a better comparator than if you just take a coin flip. And so whether comparing to a coin flip makes sense for future studies is a question to answer. Another thing that we need to better understand is what error tolerance would lead to meaningful improvements in quality of life, and for what people. So the Epilepsy Foundation did a study in 2021 asking people, in one instances, would you be willing to tolerate false positives and false negatives? And surprisingly, they found that even if the seizure detection device or seizure prediction devices had false positives or false negative predictions, a large percentage of people would still want to be able to use the seizure prediction device. But whether this is true in different circumstances and how well we're able to anticipate the future and whether we would actually be okay with those errors is something that will be difficult to know until we have something in prospective use. And lastly, it would be helpful to have community collaborations between physicians and people living with epilepsy, family members, and people developing these devices to determine standards that will actually meaningfully improve quality of life and ethical anticipations before we get to a place where it's actually in clinical use. And so there's some work that's ongoing that's set out different examples of different ethical considerations that be considered, and these can be used, for example, as starting points for discussion in these community collaborations. So in summary, what do we know about if it's possible? So we know that it is possible to forecast seizures non-invasively for a percentage of people, but whether it's useful is something that is still not completely clear. We know that current implementations can beat a coin flip, but not yet a simple average, and whether or not that's actually useful for people is something we need to find out. And prospective trials are needed in order to understand whether the performance that we have from retrospective data will translate and generalize into prospective data. And lastly, we are in need for more collaborations to determine what are the ethical things that we're going to need to think about before these things emerge. Thank you.
Invite our speakers to come up. And we'll open it up to any questions there may be.
Thank you. That's a wonderful presentation from all of the speakers, especially Dr. Chang. That's my question for you. It's a lot of terrific work's been done in this field just recently. I guess I used to have a joke that 10 years ago I used to say there was no good seizure predictor developed in the past 30 years, and now I can say that for the past 40 years. But and still, it's barely better than a coin flip in a small number of patients. Do you get the sense that for most of the patients, seizures are just not predictable, no matter what data stream we have, or is the data stream that we currently have just not sufficient and we just need to look for something new?
My impression, oops. Thank you. I think it may not be that it's not predictable. I think one question is how good is a performance that's going to be needed to contribute to meaningful quality of life, and then can we attain that performance is another question. If it's 100%, positive, it's 100%. It might be very difficult, but I think there's also ongoing developments from a methodological standpoint. Only recently, for example, have attention. So one of the mechanisms for transformer models, which is one of the things that is used for long periods of time series, was only published a few years ago. I have not yet seen an implementation of that used for time series prediction in, for example, these sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of methodological new things that are coming out which haven't yet found their way into our field. I think seizures are also difficult because sometimes they're an observed manifestation of something that isn't necessarily observable, like if you have some sort of difference in your inhibitory and excitatory activity. And so models for accounting for that are also in development. But I think there's a lot of ongoing work in hopefully understanding what the performance metrics that we should meet are, and then those developments will hopefully make this possible in the future.
Someone over there.
Okay, so thank you very much for these great talks. This question goes to everybody of the panel. So there's this survey on patients and caregivers that they are willing to accept false positives. But now comes the question maybe to the physicians, treating physicians. How big is the extent of overtreatment that we are going to accept? So if we have false positives in a person who lives alone, how do we know whether this is a false positive or not? And how do we react? Are we going to change the treatment with the risk of overtreating patients?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. That's a very interesting question. I can't say that I have thought that much about it.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is, Rainer, what you're highlighting is that there are consequences of false positives. And so I think we owe it to people living with epilepsy or affected by epilepsy to come up with devices that don't have high rates of false positives. The consequences are overtreatment. Another consequence of false positives might be disrupted sleep that results in more seizures because people are sleep deprived. And we're aiming to improve quality of life for people with epilepsy. And we hear time and time again, particularly in pediatric epilepsy and in pediatric drug-resistant epilepsy, we hear time and time again that quality of life and other metrics actually even supersede, for some people, seizure frequency. And so just because people with epilepsy are telling us we're okay with false positives, I think we need to take that message as a sign that we haven't done a good enough job at giving options that are really what people need.
And also, yeah, absolutely. And I think you're getting at an important point there, that the false positives, they really have to be reduced if seizure detection devices are going to be broadly implemented to have an impact on, for instance, SUDEP risk. Because in the Torbjörn Thomson and Svensson work that was described, so in Sweden, the majority, or a narrow majority, but still, of SUDEP cases, they actually occurred in low-risk individuals, because there are many more low-risk individuals than high-risk individuals if you look at the frequency, etc. So
many of the cases that we heard today,
yeah,
actually from families and
to get acceptance for using devices there, and I think other strategies as well, seizure first aid, etc. would be. It has to be a program where the devices are important. But yeah, interesting question.
I think we are at time, yeah. So happy to talk offline with anybody who has other questions.
Find us after.
And we have a break coming up, so we'll be on break for 15 minutes. Thanks again to our panel.